What's up everyone, this is Christy with Brown Girl Green. I wanted to do a quick summary video about what went down at COP26, otherwise known as the UN climate change negotiations. So the main goal of this year's climate negotiations was to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2030. And unfortunately, we're seeing with the way policies are getting implemented so slow, we're actually on the trajectory towards 2.7 degrees Celsius warming, which is really dangerous and horrible for the planet, going to be catastrophic for millions of people around the world. So they really wanted to make sure that this conference, they took it a bit more seriously to honor the 1.5 degrees Celsius agreement that they agreed to back in Paris in 2015. So they came up with this thing called the Glasgow Climate Pact. And the Glasgow Climate Pact, the goal of it is to basically honor that whole 1.5 degrees thing. And essentially it's giving countries that participate in the UN climate talks homework. Because the idea is that they want to make sure that carbon emissions have to fall by 45% by 2030 in order to, get somewhat close to that 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming that we don't want to exceed. And so basically, the Glasgow Climate Pact has new rules for trading carbon credits across borders, a call for nations to return in 2022 with stronger, more ambitious climate goals, which is, we're going to get into that later on why that's interesting. And then there's going to be a request for a yearly report summarizing nations' annual commitments to reduce their emissions. Again, it's about homework. And the last nifty thing they included in last minute was a phase down of unabated coal. Not a phase out, a phase down of coal, which some people viewed that as a victory, other people viewed it as just like ridiculous because, given the fact that the planet is on fire, we should be phasing out of fossil fuels, transitioning out of it, and unfortunately, the people leading this conference are still very much under the opinion that we need fossil fuels, and we're going to move very slowly to move away from that. Things that could be considered wins during the climate conference. One thing was that more than 130 nations agreed to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030, which, if they commit to it, I think trees are pretty low-hanging fruit. I think it'll happen. That could be a really good thing for decarbonization and, overall restoring ecosystems around the world. Go trees. Another thing that came out of it is that over 100 nations pledged to cut 30% of their methane emissions. Personally, I thought that was really exciting because methane is also a very potent greenhouse gas outside of carbon dioxide, and they made goals now to, be able to cut their emissions from that by 2030. Again, how this will get implemented, there's a pattern here. Last minute, the US and China agreed to work together on future climate work. Remains to be seen what that's going to look like, but we'll see what's up with that. And then the last thing was that 450 institutions that oversee over $130 trillion in assets actually agreed to align their portfolios with the goal of achieving what is known as net zero, which is the idea that the emissions that are released from producing goods and services from a company gets, knocked out or reduced by offsets or, cleaning up their supply chain. Again, with things like net zero, it can easily head into the greenwashing territory, just because if a company is planting a forest somewhere but still burning lots of fossil fuels, polluting the environment, not really making any efforts to actually address their emissions at every level of their supply chain, it remains to be seen if this is actually, going to be really effective or just a nice PR stunt. So we'll see. And now we have to get into the failures. I feel like this year's climate talks were a failure in many ways. The discussion about getting rid of and transitioning out of fossil fuels is still such a slow and contentious discussion when we don't have time for that. We have to figure out how to actually get the infrastructure and, roadmap ready to figure out how we're going to actually decarbonize every sector that we have in society today. And I don't know how that's going to even be possible if we're still dependent on fossil fuels. Even the COP president was like, what the heck, man? Why did this happen? Another big failure was climate finance. So the UN Environment Program estimates that countries in the global south need $70 billion per year for adaptation, and this figure is expected to double by 2030. Going into these climate talks, a lot of people who come from countries who are on the front lines of the climate crisis were very hopeful that maybe, the wealthier, mostly emitting nations in the West would actually be more strategic and stringent about how they were going to up that money. And this adaptation fund was established when I was 6 years old in 2001. Now we're here in 2021, I am now 26, and basically that number is still only in the millions for that fund. Glasgow Climate Pact tried to, tip its hat to that desire by saying that rich nations who do have the resources will need to at least double their finance for adaptation by 2025. The track record is really not this great on this. And the thing is like, those countries that, are small island nations that are on the front lines of drought and fire, etc., they need those resources to have infrastructure, to be able to adapt, to be able to make resilience plans. And basically, these wealthy nations are coming up billions of dollars short to show anything for that. Another thing that they really messed up on is that wealthier countries blocked the move to create a loss and damage fund. And basically, this loss and damage fund would be acknowledging the fact that wealthier nations are the reason that the climate crisis is happening, and that countries that do come from, the global south should not have to bear the burden. Yet the money, how it's going to be distributed, all those things are now left to be this future conversation, which is a huge failure of COP26. People say that the Glasgow Climate Pact, in some ways, like I said, is a great sign that countries may actually do their homework because they'll feel like someone's looking over their shoulder on a year-by-year basis for greater ambitions. If they actually follow through on it, actually make plans and figure out how they're going to do this, sure, it could be great, but it doesn't seem like they've fulfilled their commitments thus far, and I remain skeptical that they're going to continue even doing that. And in 2023, nations will be meeting again to actually figure out if their emissions reduction targets are strategic enough or actually meeting the needs. And for me, I just feel like the climate talks were such a depressing and frustrating space, as they usually are. I felt like, the indigenous leadership there, the activism, seeing so many young people who are pressuring from the outside, I feel like leaders are sweating more. They're not sweating at the level they need to be, but I definitely think that they're realizing that they really messed up this year, and for me, in a weird way, that kind of gives me some hope. Yeah, that's my quick summary of what went down at COP26. Would love to hear y'all's thoughts, and I think ultimately we are going to need to join together and collaborate and fight for a better future. And I wanted to leave on a last note of shouting out Earth Justice for helping support the creation of this video of my summary of COP26. They are a group of lawyers who are fighting to protect the earth. They are doing the work beyond COP26, and I'm grateful that I get to collaborate with folks like them to be able to tell these stories, to share this education, so we can all use those tools and mobilize for a better world. Thanks so much.